Chapter 2 of Contracts, Voidable Contracts and Void Agreements. Section 10. What agreements are contracts? All agreements are contracts if they are made by the free consent of the parties competent to contract for a lawful consideration and with a lawful object and are not hereby expressly declared to be void. Nothing herein contained shall affect any law in force in India and not hereby expressly repealed, by which any contract is required to be made in writing or in the presence of witnesses or any law relating to the registration of documents. Section 11. Who are competent to contracts? Every person is competent to contract who is age of majority according to the law to which he is subject and of sound mind, and is not disqualified from contracting by any law to which he is subject. Section 12. What is a sound mind for the purpose of contracting? A person is said to be of sound mind for the purpose of making a contract if, at the time when he makes it, he is capable of understanding it and of forming a rational judgment as to its effect upon his interest. A person who is usually of unsound mind but occasionally of sound mind may make a contract when he is of sound mind. A person who is usually of sound mind but occasionally of unsound mind may not make a contract when he is of unsound mind. Illustrations. Illustration A. A patient in a lunatic asylum who is at intervals of sound mind may contract during those intervals. Illustration B. A sane man who is delirious from fever or who is so drunk that he cannot understand the terms of a contract or form a rational judgment as to its effect on his interest cannot contract whilst such delirium or drunkenness lasts. Section 13. Consent defined. Two or more persons are said to consent when they agree upon the same thing in the same sense. Section 14. Free consent defined. Consent is said to be free when it is not caused by coercion as defined in section 15, undue influence as defined in section 16, fraud as defined in section 17, misrepresentation as defined in section 18, or mistake subject to the provision of section 20, 21 and 22. Consent is said to be so caused when it would not have been given but for the existence of such coercion, undue influence, fraud, misrepresentation or mistake. Section 15. Coercion defined. Coercion is the committing or threatening to commit any act forbidden by the Indian Penal Code or the unlawful detaining or threatening to detain any property to the prejudice of any person whatever, with the intention of causing any person to enter into an agreement. Explanation 1. It is immaterial whether Indian Penal Code is or is not in force in the place where the coercion is employed. Illustrations. A on board an English on the high seas causes B to enter into an agreement by an act amounting to criminal intimidation under Indian Penal Code. A afterwards sues B for breach of contract at Calcutta. A has employed coercion, although his act is not an offence by the law of England, and although section 506 of the Indian Penal Code was not in force at the time or the place where the act was done. Section 16. Undue influence defined. Subsection 1. A contract is said to be induced by undue influence where the relations subsisting between the parties are such that one of the parties is in a position to dominate the will of the other and uses that position to obtain an unfair advantage over the other. Subsection 2. In particular and without prejudice to the generality of the foregoing principle, a person is said to be deemed to be in a position to dominate the will of another, A. Where he holds a real or apparent authority over the other, or where he stands in a fiduciary relation to the other. B. Where he makes a contract with a person whose mental capacity is temporarily or permanently affected by reason of age, illness, or mental or bodily distress. And 3. Where a person who is in a position to dominate the will of another enters into a contract with him and the transaction appears on the face of it or on the evidence adduced to be unconscionable, the burden of proving that such contract was not induced by undue influence shall lie upon the person in a position to dominate the will of the other. Nothing in this section shall affect the provision of section 111 of the Indian Evidence Act 1872. Illustrations. A having advanced money to his son B during his minority, upon B's coming of age obtains by misuse of parental influence a bond from B for a greater amount than the sum due in respect of the advance. A employed undue influence. Illustration B. A man enfeebled by disease or age is induced by B's influence over him as his medical attendant to agree to pay B an unreasonable sum for his professional services. B employed undue influence. Illustration C. A being in debt to B, the moneylender of his village, contracts a fresh loan on the terms which appears to be unconscionable. It lies on B to prove that the contract was not induced by undue influence. Illustration D. A applies to a banker for a loan at a time when there is stringency in the money market. The banker declines to make the loan except at an unusually high rate of interest. A accepts the loan on these terms. This is a transaction in the ordinary course of business and the contract is not induced by undue influence. Section 17. Fraud defined. Fraud means and includes any of the following acts committed by a party to a contract or who is connivance or by his agent with intent to deceive another party thereto or his agent or to induce him to enter into a contract. Number 1. The suggestion as a fact of that which is not true by one who does not believe it to be true. Number 2. The active concealment of a fact by one having knowledge or belief of the fact. 3. A promise made without any intention of performing it. 4. Any other act fitted to deceive. 5. Any such act or omission as the law specially declares to be fraudulent. Explanation. Mere silence as to facts likely to affect the willingness of a person to enter into a contract is not fraud, unless the circumstances of the case are such that regard being had to them, it is the duty of the person keeping silence to speak, or unless his silence is in itself equivalent to speech. Illustrations. Illustration A. A sells by auction to B a horse which A knows to be unsound. A says nothing to B about the horse's unsoundness. This is not fraud in A. Illustration B. B is A's daughter and has just come of age. Here, the relation between the parties would make it A's duty to tell B if the horse is unsound. Illustration C. B says to A, "If you do not deny it, I shall assume that the horse is sound." A says nothing. Here, A's silence is equivalent to speech. Illustration D. A and B being traders enter upon a contract. A has private information of change in prices which would affect B's willingness to proceed with the contract. A is not bound to inform B. Section 18. Misrepresentation defined. Misrepresentation means and includes: number 1. The positive assertion as a manner, in a manner not warranted by the information of the person making it of that which is not true, though he believes it to be true. Number 2. Any breach of duty which, without an intent to deceive, gains an advantage to the person committing it or anyone claiming under him by misleading another to his prejudice or to the prejudice of anyone claiming under him. Number 3. Causing, however innocently, a party to an agreement to make a mistake as to the substance of the thing which is the subject matter of the agreement. Section 19. Voidability of agreement without free consent. When consent to an agreement is caused by coercion, fraud or misrepresentation, the agreement is a contract voidable at the option of the party whose consent was so caused. A party to a contract whose consent was caused by fraud, misrepresentation may, if he thinks fit, insist that the contract shall be performed and that he shall be put in the position in which he would have been if presentation made had been true. Exception. If such consent was caused by misrepresentation or by silence, fraudulent within the meaning of section 17, the contract nevertheless is not voidable if the party whose consent was so caused had the means discovering the truth with ordinary diligence. Explanation. A fraud or misrepresentation which did not cause the consent to contract of the party on whom such fraud was practiced or to whom such misrepresentation was made does not render a contract voidable. Read the explanation again. A fraud or misrepresentation which did not cause the consent to a contract of the party on whom such fraud was practiced or to whom such representation was made does not render a contract voidable. Illustration. Illustration A. A, intending to deceive B, falsely represent that 500 mounds of indigo are made annually at A's factory and thereby induces A to buy the factory. The contract is voidable at the option of B. Illustration B. A, by a misrepresentation, lead B erroneously to believe that 500 mounds of indigo are made annually at A's factory. B examines the accounts of the factory, which shows that only 400 mounds of indigo have been made. After this, B buys the factory. The contract is not voidable on account of A's misrepresentation because B has sufficient opportunity to discover the truth with ordinary diligence. Illustration C. A fraudulently informs B that A's estate is free from encumbrances. B thereupon buys the estate. The estate is subject to a mortgage. B may either avoid the contract or may insist on its being carried out and the mortgage debt redeemed. Illustration D. B, having discovered a vein of ore on the estate of A, adopts means to conceal and does conceal the existence of the ore from A. Though A's ignorance, B is embedded to buy through A's ignorance, B is enabled to buy the estate at an undervalue. The contract is voidable at the option of A. Illustration E. A is entitled to succeed to an estate at the death of B. B dies. C, having received intelligence of B's death, prevents the intelligence reaching A and thus induces A to sell him his interest in the estate. The sale is voidable at the option of A. Section 19A. Power to set aside contract induced by undue influence. When consent to an agreement is caused by undue influence, the agreement is a contract voidable at the option of the party whose consent was so caused. Any such contract may be set aside either absolutely or, if the party whose consent was entitled to avoid it has received any benefit thereupon, upon such terms and conditions as the court may consider proper or may seem just. Illustrations. Illustration A. A's son had forged B's name to a promissory note. B, under threat of prosecuting A's son, obtains a bond from A for the amount of the forged note. If B sues on this bond, the court may set aside the bond. Illustration B. A moneylender advances ₹100 to B, an agriculturalist, and by undue influence induces B to execute a bond of ₹200 with interest at 6% per month. the court may set aside the bond, ordering B to repay the 100 with such interest as may seem just. Section 20. Agreement void, where both parties are under mistake as to matter of fact. Where both the parties to an agreement are under a mistake as to a matter of fact essential to the agreement is void. Explanation. An erroneous opinion as to the value of the thing which forms the subject matter of the agreement is not to be deemed a mistake as to a matter of fact. Illustration. Illustration A. A agrees to sell to B a specific cargo of goods supposed to be on its way from England to Bombay. It turns out that before the day of the bargain, the ship conveying the cargo had been cast away and the goods are lost. Neither party was aware of these facts. The agreement is void. Illustration B. A agrees to buy from B a certain horse. It turns out that the horse was dead at the time of bargain. Though neither party was aware of the fact, the agreement is void. Illustration C. A, being entitled to an estate for the life of B, agrees to sell it to C. B was dead at the time of the agreement, but both parties were ignorant of the fact. The agreement is void.